Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at Ironhack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Hey Engagers, welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. And today we are with Andy. But Andy, before we kick off, are you prepared to engage?
I am ready to engage, Rob.
Let's do this. Let's go, because we have Andy Yeoman. Is that the way to say it?
Yeoman, yes.
Yeoman, yes. And he is the co-founder and director of Focus Games. And prior to entering the world of serious games, he completed an undergrad in human biology and worked in sales, marketing, and client relationship roles for international life sciences organizations. Focus Games, which is the company that he founded, launched in 2004 to develop education and learning games to change thinking and behavior. They achieved this through both physical board games, in-person, and digital games with virtual options as well. And they work primarily in the health and social care sector. They make learning memorable, enjoyable, and effective, of course, encouraging players to discuss new ideas, share knowledge, and learn from each other. Andy, I hope that's a good intro. If there's anything we missed, make sure to say it now.
I think you got it all there, Rob. Thank you.
Great. So, Andy, beyond all the fantastic things you've done, we always like to get in a little bit closer to our guests and understand what does a day in the life of Andy look like? Or, what does being Andy look like in these days, basically?
Oh, busy and stressful at the moment. We're very busy. I mean, as a company, we have a design studio. It is in Glasgow, which is in Scotland. My business partner manages the design studio, so that's where the development team are. I live in England, which is quite a few hundred kilometers away, so I work from home. And my job is really to look at the new business development client relationships, but most importantly, I write most of the content that goes into the game. So I'm the one who's drafting out the storyboards, the narrative structure, and then writing the content that goes into the games. So my day involves lots of different things. It's talking to customers, potential customers, trying to deliver existing projects, and at the same time researching and writing the content for new games.
Very busy, quite a few things going on, and that's always exciting, right? You were saying that you're now working from home from quite a while, and that, all that, I'm guessing the different functions and things you're doing keeps it exciting as well.
It does. I mean, in a way, really fortunate. I know that for most people, developing games is already quite unusual, but we develop lots of different games that address lots of different subjects, and usually I don't really know very much about the subject. So every time we develop a new game, I get to learn something new. I don't become an expert. I scratch the surface, but I still get to learn something new and interesting about something I didn't know before.
That sounds fantastic and exciting. It's part of one of the things that I really enjoyed a lot of during my time as a project manager at IE Business School at the time, at the sort of multimedia creation. One of the things that we were doing was learning. This was more not on the science and biology side, but rather on the business side. It was relatively recently after my MBA, so it was pretty exciting to get sort of a extra sessions of your MBA from another school, which was where I was working at, and getting to learn a little bit more about those materials that we were making. So I kind of have a feel for that excitement of learning new things every time you're creating a new material as well. So that's very exciting, Andy. And taking a little spin on that, because we always like to start here with plenty of lessons and learnings from our guests. And one of them, and I would say one of the main things we like to learn from, is what we like to call fail, or first attempts in learning. So can you bring a story of, once in your plenty of experience that you have on these educational learning games that you've been for quite a while, that, you were going north, things went south, we want to be there with you, take those lessons and be there and learn with you, basically.
Yeah, I thought hard about this question, and on being honest, when I say I don't think we've had any sort of catastrophic or really memorable mistakes. It's been quite a gradual sort of iterative process of us learning how to make games that work. Because when we started the company, neither my business partner nor I had any background in game development. So we were looking at using games as a way of applying our business sort of knowledge and experience to help big organizations to deliver change. So we already had a fairly clear-cut idea of what it is that we wanted to do with the games. And I guess we were fortunate in that the format or the style of game that we decided to use turned out to be quite popular and quite effective. And so we just over the years improved the way that we developed them and delivered them. But I don't think we made any terrible mistakes, really. I think it's been a sort of gradual process of improvement. I mean, we've made plenty of small mistakes and errors along the way. And, and our games are now quite different to the ones that we made back in 2004, 2005. But there was never, I don't think anything stands out as being that terrible. And that's not that we're geniuses. We were just fortunate. We hit on the right idea and I think we had the right skills and experience to be able to make it work.
I think that the main thing there is, as you were saying, that it was an iterative process. So one thing I like to say on this question as well is, no failure is fatal or final. There are most things in life, and especially in creating games and gamification can be mostly fixed, and that's what iteration is all about, and about, play testing and getting things to work that maybe didn't work initially. So I don't know if there's perhaps a time where that happened. You were aiming in one direction. Of course, you maybe were in the early stages. You knew you had to test, and things had to take a relatively dramatic spin, again, even from the perspective of, we're in the early stages, but we have to kind of change the idea we had initially. Did that ever happen either?
Well, I'd love to be able to come back to you and say, yes, it did, but no, it didn't in many ways, because, my business partner is a professional project and program manager, so we always applied a fairly rigorous and clear process to what we were doing. And our games are not incredibly complex as games. The games are designed to deliver the content, and the content tends to be the written word and also, words that encourage discussion and debate. So our games are not so complex that the game itself would fail. The failure would come from us not really understanding the problem that we were supposed to be trying to solve with the game. We always work in collaboration with subject matter experts because, as I said, we tend not to be experts in the subject matter that the games address. So really, I think our role is more about facilitating and encouraging the subject matter expert to give us the information that we need that we can then condense and convert and translate to make it work in a relatively simple game. So yet again, sorry to disappoint, but no horrible, horrible, memorable mistakes. Our customers may have some horrible, memorable mistakes from working with us, but I can't remember them.
That's good. That's all good. So how do you manage? And that's, I'm jumping a little bit ahead into process, but you're mentioning that it is your process what keeps you away from making those mistakes. Can you give us a heads up? We'd like to have an overview of what your process looks like to be able to precisely catch these things perhaps on the fly.
Yeah, sure. We try to keep it simple. As I say, nearly every game that we develop in collaboration and partnership with external subject matter experts. And we're really fortunate that usually those people come to us and they say, could you develop a game that would address this specific subject? So they're already highly motivated. They understand that games could help them to deliver education, training, change, and they recognize us as being experts in the field who could help them to turn their idea into a game. So the process is designed to make that collaboration as effective and efficient as we possibly can, because nearly always the subject matter expert has a day job and their day job doesn't include developing a game. So we have to make really efficient use of their time to get the information that we need from them so we can create a game. So right at the beginning of a game process, it's really, why does this person want us to develop a game for them? The assumption always is that they have a problem of some sort that they need to solve, whether that's that their training's not as effective as it might be, or they're a university lecturer and they want a better way of engaging their students, or they work in a hospital and they want to improve training for doctors and nurses. but there's always ultimately an objective. They're trying to achieve something by creating a game. And the process really is founded entirely on us right at the beginning understanding what it is that they want, and then being able to build a fairly clear idea of who would be playing the game, why would they be playing the game, where would they be playing the game, what do we want them to be learning and discussing during the game, and most importantly, what do we want them to do at the end of the game. And we've condensed that down to a series of really basic questions that we spend the first 2 or 3 hours of any kickoff meeting with the client just getting the answers to those questions, so everybody understands exactly why this game is being developed and what the purpose and objective of the game is. I don't know if that's helpful, but I hope so.
Yeah, actually is. It actually sounds like a very sound, very good process. And, it also puts the right pieces in the right places. Having that SME that you were mentioning, like all these things I think make sense. And if it's brought you that much success and, catching those potential things or potential issues almost in the act or even before they happen, that makes it very successful and very useful as well hopefully for everybody else.
It works for us. I mean, as I say, it's been a gradual process, making the process itself, the development process, as efficient as it can be. But we started out with a process and it's got better, but we always had a process for co-developing games. I mean, for us, it's partly about efficiency from a commercial point of view, because we're being paid to develop the games. And of course, we want to make the process as profitable as we possibly can. It's not just about developing an effective game. It's also about maximizing the profit so we can pay the rent and pay the salaries of our employees. So,
not a bad objective at all.
Yeah, I mean, the process fulfilled several roles, but they're all ending up at the same point, that we develop a game that we're happy with, the client's happy with, and most importantly, the people who play it are happy with it.
Sounds great. So, Andy, talking about, clients being happy, things going actually well, is there perhaps, not a failure, but actually a time where you set out to do this game and you're maybe particularly proud of the results of that game that you guys created? Maybe run us through that story. How did that go? Maybe there we can dive a little bit more into the examples of, what does each of these parts of the process look like in action, you actually doing it. You don't need to name any names or get into any specifics of who that is or what the exact content is, but perhaps run us through that. And we would like to, maybe find some of those factors for success.
Yeah, God, I'm turning out to be quite a disappointment here. I'm trying to think of, I mean, it's interesting actually that because quite often we don't really know very much about the subject matter that a game's going to address, our predictions for which games are going to be most successful are sometimes wrong. And I think that one of our most successful games is called the Dysphagia game. And it's quite a technical game aimed at healthcare professionals. And it's designed to help them to understand the fact that some people have difficulty swallowing. And it can be life-threatening. And so it's really a game to help people understand how do you stop people with that swallowing condition from ending up with malnutrition, but also from dying. And we thought this was quite a niche subject. And it turns out that game is probably our most successful game. It's now been translated, I think, into 7 different languages. It's been used on every continent. It's being used in care homes for the elderly. It's being used in hospitals. It's been used in universities. So I think maybe we've learned not to try and form too many preconceptions about a game, about how successful it's going to be. I mean, from a commercial point of view, we have to think about that because a lot of the games that we develop, we ultimately sell them. So we have to have some vague understanding of how popular might this game be so that we can get the price right and understand how we're going to promote it and support the sales of the game. But it's great successes. I mean, I'd like to say that all of our games in one way or another are successful, and the measure of success really is, are people using them, playing them, and telling us that they're finding them useful.
So how did you arrive to that game that you were mentioning, that Dysphagia, I think was the name that you mentioned, right?
Dysphagia, yes.
So what was the process? How did somebody come to you? Again, I don't know if you need to reveal anything in particular or anything.
No,
but
it's fine. It's in the public domain. So
nice.
as I said earlier, I think we're really, really fortunate that as the company has developed more games, and we've developed over 100 games since we started, so there are a lot of
Wow.
games out there.
Not a small number.
No, we're making new games all the time, and we're fortunate because people come to us. So I'd like to say that we're geniuses and that all of the games that we've developed have been our idea. Most of them haven't been. They've been people coming to us and saying, hey, I've seen another game that you developed and I'd really, really like to develop a game to address this subject or this problem. Do you think you can help? And of course, yes, we probably can. And the added benefit is that usually they are a subject matter expert in this. So they're usually a well-recognized clinician, academic, somebody who's well-recognized as being an expert in this field. So we get to work from the beginning with people who know exactly what they're talking about. And it really makes the process much, much easier. And as I say, we're really fortunate. We get to meet lots of interesting people who are experts in their field, and we get to spend time with them, and they share what they know with us, and we create games from it.
Nice. Very nice. So that part of the process where somebody comes to you, I think, is perhaps one of the keys of the things that you've been doing. And I'd be curious about, I'm not sure if your process was similar, but I can remember the stories of how the department I used to work for at IE Business School started in that sense. Like initially it was more of a push effort, like, we're building this thing for many reasons. Like, we're doing these things. Would you be interested in building this with us? Like, we'll do everything for you, like asking people around to come in, professors in that sense. Whereas when I was, in my last few years that I was there, it was more of, we have a pool of people who are interested in doing things with us. We have to pick and choose because we don't have enough people to take care of everything, like at the same time. So it was kind of a shift in that sense. And as well, the commercial aspect started coming actually during the time that I was there. So was that process similar for you? How did it come? How did it start? How did you maybe develop it? Would perhaps be an interesting thing for the audience.
Yet again, we were really, really fortunate that the first game that we were paid to develop came from somebody that we knew who worked for a large pharmaceutical drug company. And they wanted us to develop a game for one of the hospitals that they were working with. And we hadn't really thought about developing games for healthcare before, but they were paying us and we were a new company, so it was great. So we made this game for them, and we were playing the game, facilitating the game in the hospital with doctors and nurses. And somebody from the government, the Department of Health here in the UK, was walking past the room, and they saw what was happening. They came in and they took a photograph of the game on their phone and they went away. And really, really fortunately for us, they were working on a huge healthcare IT national program, and they invited us to be a part of that program. So we were given a very big contract almost at the beginning of the company's existence. And that allowed us to experiment, to test things. It was just a really, really great year that we were funded to understand what we were doing, refine it, make it better. So I think that was our big break, really, was that massive healthcare IT program with the National Health Service.
Nice. And of course, that gave you visibility as well, I'm guessing.
It did. I mean, you probably know from working in serious games and gamification. I mean, certainly back in 2004, 2005, it was relatively unusual, and most people weren't that familiar with the idea of using games as a way of delivering education and training. So, I mean, a lot of the conversations that we had with people in the early days were really just about trying to persuade them that we weren't lunatics and that this wasn't a stupid idea. That's become much, much easier. Those conversations tend not to happen anymore, and people are, to whatever degree, are familiar with the idea that games and gamification are a way of delivering training and learning. So, the conversations are much less difficult now. But it was quite tricky in the early days to persuade people that this wasn't a ludicrous way of spending their money.
That they were not just wasting away all those precious and hard-earned resources, for sure.
Yeah, but I mean, every game that we actually, if we were working purely in the private sector for private companies, we would be paid to develop a game for them, to help them to deliver training, and that would be the end of it. Nobody outside of that company would ever really know that the game existed. There might be a case study, but nobody would be able to play the game. we were really fortunate in working with the National Health Service here in the UK, because every time we're paid to develop a game, we have the option of commercializing it, which means that we can sell it to all of the other hospitals and universities who might have a similar training or educational need. So lots of people are able to play our games. And of course, every time a game's played with 10, 15 people, that's 10 or 15 people who probably enjoyed the process, then might come to us with the idea for a new game. So it's like a snowball rolling down a hill. Over time, it got bigger and bigger and bigger.
Nice. So maybe a tip here is precisely that, perhaps working in projects that allow you to get visibility as well, or aiming at least initially for those kinds of things. Engagers, if you're listening and this is something that you're looking towards, creating games, not just for maybe your classroom, which is something we talk a lot about, but your classroom and maybe other classrooms as well. It's important to see how you can go for that visibility so that other people can know what your work is. And of course, expand and other people look for your experience or your expertise and the things that you've done before.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, because I would think that most serious game developers are like us, relatively small businesses. So our budget for promotion, PR, and marketing is extremely limited. We can't tell the whole world that we exist. We're not Nike or Coca-Cola. So word of mouth is really, really important. And I think also the development of social media as well helped us, that people were able to share their experiences of games through social media, which helps us, because it's essentially passive marketing as far as we're concerned. But I mean, games make really good social media posts because it's a fun activity. If it's a tabletop game, you've got a group of people who are laughing, joking, having fun. It's different. And so people like to put things on Twitter, LinkedIn, Instagram, wherever. So yet again, it's getting easier to spread the word.
Fundamental engagers. So there you go.
Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification.
And Andy, what would you say, from your experience, all the things that you've done, is there some form of a best practice or something that you would say, well, when creating these games for learning, you should always think of this thing which will probably benefit your project?
We develop a specific style or type of game, I guess. I mean, I think a lot of serious games that are developed tend to be more, I was going to say sophisticated. They look more like mainstream games, video games, than ours do. We tend to use really simple mechanisms, quite often reusing board game mechanisms like Snakes and Ladders, Ludo, really basic, intuitive game mechanisms that people will understand almost immediately. So we don't tend to use our games as a way of trying to deliver sort of visual metaphors, and our games are quite direct. We tend to use the written word within the game to get people talking to each other, or if it's a game for individuals, to get them thinking about something. So I'd say for me, because my main job is to write the content for the games, the game really exists in order to create the right environment for information to be delivered in a more efficient and effective way that's memorable as far as the player's concerned. So the use of language is really important for me. It's how do you write for a game? And it's quite different to writing something else. I mean, the subject matter experts that we deal with quite often are, published. They get lots of papers, published books. They know how to write, but they know how to write papers and books. They don't necessarily know how to take what they know and make it work within a game. And that's my job, is how do you make information accessible through the use of language? So for me, the most important part of it is really about the use of language.
So how do you use language and how do you write? Any pointers you can give somebody who's starting off in that direction?
Well, I mean, the way that I do this, and it's, I guess it's entirely linked to me as an individual, is trying to. I think there's an adage about trying to simplify something is quite difficult. It's much more difficult to explain something simply than it is to explain something in a complicated way. And I find that with the games, that we can be taking extremely complicated clinical or scientific information and trying to make it work in a game, so that if it were read aloud or if you were to read it on a screen, that it would almost immediately after the first reading make sense to you. You would understand what you were being told. You would understand what you were being asked to do, and that you would remember it. And that can be quite difficult when you're dealing with inherently complex information, especially with an audience that is probably highly educated, professional. They know more about this subject than I do, but I still need to be able to present information to them in a way that will make sense to them and won't feel patronizing.
Very interesting, very good. So nice way of seeing it and trying to go for that sort of way of understanding the writing in games. And that simplification is always something that is good, especially in the sense of making things simple to understand, not making them, available for dummies, if that word can be used, rather of making it, simple enough for it to be easily understood without changing or demeaning the concept in itself. It's a really difficult task, but one that we should always be aiming at. I'm sure you've heard this before, that, when people are actually trying to explain the concept to somebody else, you're actually getting to a greater level of understanding of many things. So getting to that level is a lot harder as well in many ways, but it makes it more palatable to many people.
Well, that's a really interesting point, Rob, because I think you're right that in order to explain something to somebody, you need to understand it yourself before you can do it effectively. And that's partly what we're trying to recreate in the games, the group games, through encouraging people to talk to each other about a subject, is that through talking about it and trying to articulate, specific aspects of the subject, you're helping to reframe the information in your head in maybe a more useful way. So that process is mirrored in the games themselves. I'm sure if I were a psychologist, I would understand this far better, but I'm sure there's lots of quite complex and sophisticated stuff happening when people are doing this.
Absolutely. And talking about these best practices and great ideas that you've mentioned, you've probably heard of the interview. You've seen the questions that we make, the kind of jazz that we get into. Is there somebody that comes to your mind that you say, well, this person, I would be perhaps interested in listening to this person answering these kinds of questions on Professor Games, sort of a future, or maybe in some cases a past guest as well?
Yeah, I thought about this one as well, and I think it might be quite good to hear from a user of serious games rather than a developer of serious games to get the customer or the player's point of view. So people who are, I'm sure that some of our clients and customers would be, happy to share their thoughts, for instance, about what it was like to develop a game with us, but more importantly, what it's like to use that game with their teams, with their colleagues, with their patients, with whoever, to get sort of see behind the curtain, I guess, what happens when the game you've developed actually ends up in the wild and people are using it for real.
There you go. So that would be an interesting one as well, having a client of Andy, maybe even some other people, clients or mainly users, as you were saying, I think would be a very interesting one to have. And continuing with the recommendations, Andy, is there a book that you would recommend to this audience, the engagers, people who are interested in using games, especially for learning? A book, again, it could be directly related to the topic or general inspiration, or, whatever you want to go for.
I tend not to read books about game development, but I was thinking about games that had a significant impact on the way that I develop games. And there are two books that come to mind, both of them that I read quite a long time ago. One of them is The Economist Style Guide, and it's published by The Economist magazine. And I'd always admired the way that their writers could take complex information and subjects and make it quite accessible to people. And they publish a really practical guide to writing clearly, and it's quite funny as well. And that, years and years and years ago, changed the way that I think about writing and communicating. So, and I'm almost certain that that's directly influenced the way that I write content for games now. And I think the other book is Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug, which I read probably back in 2001. And it's about web usability. And it was one of the first books, I think, about usability in the web. And I know that Don't Make Me Think is a bit of a counterintuitive title for what I'm talking about, but the idea is for the games is not to make the game so difficult that they get in the way of the learning. That if the game's so difficult that the players are having to spend a lot of mental time and effort learning how to play it and remember how to play it, they're not focusing on the subject matter, so you're failing. So it was about the simplicity and the usability of the actual game that book led me towards thinking about quite clearly.
Interesting. Both books can be very, very interesting. The Style Guide I had never heard of, but it resonates very much with the message that you were mentioning before, and it could be a good way as well of getting a bit into your head of how do you do that simplification of that creation of that content. And Don't Make Me Think is I started studying. I'm going to date myself here. I don't mind. I started studying computer engineering back in 2003. So that was a book that was at the time was relatively recent as well, and that got mentioned, thrown out quite a few times when we were talking about usability of the things that we were creating. So I've been hearing of it for quite a long time, and to be honest, I haven't read it, so it's definitely added as well to my list.
Yeah, they're both really good. And I think certainly the Economist Style Guide, I think, is on to probably edition number 12 or 13. And I think that Don't Make Me Think has been updated several times as well. So they're still both relevant. They're not sort of historical books by any means.
There you go. Absolutely. So they're classics that are being updated. So, classics in a different modern way as well. That sounds great. And Andy, what would you say is, if you had to say, well, this is the skill or the thing that I do at least better than most other people, what would that be, like a superpower, however you want to call it? What would that thing be?
I think it comes back again to the ability to present complex information within a game in a way that's accessible and useful to the players. And I think that goes back to those two books, really. It's all about accessibility, usability. Our games only exist in order to make information more accessible and useful for people. And because I write most of the content in the games, I guess that I'm most proud of, I think, the ability that I developed over the years to be able to write things in a reasonably concise and accessible and a clear way. So, yeah, I think it's all about writing and the presentation of information.
Fantastic. Very important superpower, especially given your specialty and the things that you're dedicating most of your time to. Very useful. And finally, a very difficult one for most of the people, at least, that come to the podcast is, what would you say is your favorite game?
Oh, yeah, this is quite shameful, I guess. I don't really spend a lot of my spare time playing games. I do play games, and I do play games regularly, but they tend to be quite simple games. So I'd be more attracted to Solitaire, Wordle, Angry Birds than Settlers of Catan. I mean, the way that I distract myself or interest myself outside of work is I read books. So I guess that yet again, it goes back to the written word. It's the use of language. So, I mean, if I had a favorite game, it would be, I guess, Wordle, Solitaire, something like that, something that's relatively simple. I see games more as a distraction rather than something that's going to be a mental challenge. Outside of work, of course. Yes.
Wordle is definitely an interesting one as well. And I don't know if you probably heard of the sort of the way it came to be. It was not somebody sort of creating a commercial game or whatever. It was just coming out of an entertainment individual or intra-family entertainment. And it eventually got to be super popular as it is. And the guy even sold it out to, I think it's New York Times at this point.
It is New York Times. Yeah, I think it was a guy in London who he coded the game for his girlfriend, I think.
Yeah.
And then just suddenly it became incredibly popular, incredibly quickly. And yes, you're right, it's now the New York Times. And that creates lots of interesting conversations on Twitter around the use of American spellings versus British English spellings of words.
I'm sure, definitely. I don't. My wife has been playing it for quite a few weeks now, and I don't remember the first one that had sort of that characteristic of being written in two different ways. The words tend to be relatively short, a 5-letter word, so
yeah,
it's less probable to find these words where there's that difference, but I'm sure there have been.
I mean, as an English speaker, I think that people are really, really happy to be outraged by the use of an American English spelling. And so, yeah, you get some really entertaining comments on Twitter from pedants and
some very healthy entertainment as well.
Yeah.
So thanks again, Andy, for all that wisdom, all the experience that you've shared here on Professor Game. I don't know if you have any final words, if you may. Where can you find out more about you? I don't know. This is a time sort of open mic in that sense, so that before we say goodbye.
Yeah, thanks, Rob. I've really enjoyed it. As I said, I think before we started recording, I'm a big fan of podcasts, so it's really interesting for me to see what happens behind the scenes. So I've really enjoyed the process. As far as getting in touch with us, if you Google Focus Games or type in focusgames.com, you'll get to our website. Similarly, on Twitter, @Focus Games will get you to the corporate website. I'm on LinkedIn as Andy Yeoman. And I'm also on Twitter as @Andy Yeoman. So yeah, lots of different ways of finding us, but I think we're fairly Google friendly.
Thank you very much, Andy, for being here once again, for sharing your experience, your knowledge, being here for the engagers, giving experience, advice, all the stuff that you've given away. However, at least for now and for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this interview with Andy. And I'd like to know if you have any future questions that you would like to make sure that get answered by other guests. If you do, please go ahead and go to professorgame.com/question and ask your question. If it gets selected, it'll come up in a future episode and you will get your answer live in one of these interviews. And remember, before you go on to your next mission, remember to subscribe or follow, whatever that looks like, on your podcasting app, and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.